Welcome everybody to welcome to the Arvada Museum. My name is Martin Eskejian. If you all take your seats, we'll start in about 1 minute. Maybe we'll start in a minute. That's okay. If you'll all take your seats, we'll start in about 30 seconds. Please put your phones on silent because this will be recorded live and will be it's live. My name is Martin Eskejian. I'm the chairman of the Arvada Eskejian Museum. This was my father's vision to have the chapel and the museum downstairs. So welcome everybody. We're glad to see some new faces, and I think you'll enjoy today's lecture. Today's topic is the topics of Armenian migration to North America, 1885 to 1915. Just so you know, we have another program scheduled for the 28th of March, and it will be at the Organization of Istanbul Armenians, and it's by, the topic is A Wedding of Armenian Types, Armenians' Customs, Revisiting a Wedding in Mush, circa 1890, by Professor Vaskin Davidian. He's a Gulbenkian postdoc fellow and on the faculty at the University of Oxford. So that's the 28th at, I believe, 4 p.m., correct? Okay, so today, Professor David Gutman, he is an associate professor of history, Manhattanville College in New York, just north of New York City. This paper and this talk will discuss the migrants who were kind of forced into limbo between the Turkish government and the American government, and deportation, and where would they go and how. His book will be available after the talk, and I'll read you one quote by a professor at University of New Hampshire. Path-breaking analysis of Armenian migration under the Ottoman Empire, a refreshing departure from Western-centric studies of migration policies. Gutman's attention to internal politics and the convergence of Ottoman and U.S. migration policies makes this a study of critical interest to Ottomanists and migration historians alike. A powerful examination of the state's mixed success in using migration and nationality laws to target minority groups. And the professor has spent many months and years in Turkey researching this, so he's a total expert on the subject. So, Professor Gutman. Okay, there's the book.
Can you hear me? Oh, perfect. Okay. Let's see. There we go. Let me test with the... Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Eskejian, and thank you, Maggie, for your very generous invitation for me to come give this talk, and it's especially special for me to be giving this book talk at the Arvada Eskejian Museum, because I was here 2 years ago. Is that too loud, by the way? It's okay? Okay, perfect. I was here 2 years ago when Maggie and the museum hosted the 400th anniversary of Armenians in America. And it was served also as a book launch for Haik Demoyan's beautiful book, the compilation of different images and stories of 4 centuries of Armenian life in the Western Hemisphere. And while I was there, before I gave my little talk, I was perusing the images that were on the edge of the auditorium. And I came across this image here, and I'm reading the little description below it, and I'm floored when I read the name of the person sitting right here, laying right here, Ohannes Topalian. Because I had encountered Ohannes Topalian many times in my research. And for the first time, I'm coming face to face with a person whose experiences, whose life, whose existence I had only known in text. And to be able to see this image was shocking, to come face to face again with somebody who was never famous, was never well known, and yet had been such a presence in my research, in the documents that I was reading. And Ohannes Topalian's story is especially fascinating. He was born in the early 1870s in the central eastern Anatolian city of Gurin, or Gurun today. When he was around 20 years old, he decided to leave his hometown for North America, ending up eventually in Providence, Rhode Island, where he worked for several years in a factory. In 1897, after 5 years of residency in the United States, he naturalized as an American citizen. And that next year, 1898, perhaps coming face to face with the kind of nationalistic fervor in the United States surrounding the Spanish-American War, decided to enlist in the U.S. Army. And he was soon thereafter shipped off to Cuba. And of course, it's in this context where this image was taken. And I mean, this image is fascinating on a number of levels, right? Of course, somebody is taking a picture of somebody taking a picture of the group. So that's fascinating in its own right. And here is Ohannes. He is laying down in his Spanish-American War outfits with his martini rifle. I'm not sure if this is in Cuba or the United States, but he serves gallantly in the war. He receives an honorable discharge and returns to civilian life the next year, 1899. But then 1899 rolls into 1900. He is getting up there in years, approaching the ripe old age of 30, and he receives a letter from his father back home saying, "Come home, I found a bride for you." And so he returns to Gurin, where he marries, and he has a child, and he eventually settles in nearby Kayseri, where he works for a while, spends several years as his baby daughter grows to toddlerhood. And then in 1906, he decides that he wants to return to his adoptive country, the United States, with his wife and young daughter in tow. Yet, for reasons that will become clear, it's not so easy as just leaving, getting on a boat, and going back to the United States. So, before heading off on his long trans-hemispheric trek with his wife and his daughter, he goes to the city of Sebastia, which is about 200 kilometers to the north, the place where the closest U.S. consulate is. And he visits the U.S. consul in Sivas, and he requests a passport, a U.S. passport. And he presents all sorts of evidence that he is in fact not only a United States citizen, but also a decorated Spanish-American War veteran. So he presents his naturalization certificate, he presents his discharge papers. He even performs drill for the consul to show that he is in fact who he claims to be, a United States citizen and an American war veteran. And he asks to be granted a passport. And the U.S. consul says no, because we can't recognize your citizenship. By returning to your home country, you have, in our eyes, voluntarily expatriated yourself. You have given up your citizenship. And so the U.S. consul refuses to give him a passport, despite the fact that he has this evidence showing he is in fact a naturalized citizen, that he in fact fought bravely for his adopted country. And he goes home dejected. He eventually appears again in 1907 in U.S. consular records, this time in Alexandria in Egypt, where he once again goes to the U.S. consulate, this time in Alexandria, requesting a passport, again claiming citizenship. And he's once again denied. Now we'll pick up Ohannes' story in a bit, but Ohannes Topalian's story is emblematic of many of the themes that I address in the book. My book is really a study of the politics of mobility, of people moving back and forth between the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire and North America, and the efforts of both the Ottoman government and U.S. government to respond to this mobility back and forth. And Ohannes's, the goal of the book is essentially to answer a set of questions that Ohannes's story raises. Why did people like Ohannes migrate in the first place? Why did they go to North America? How did they leave? Obviously, these are relatively, at least as far as the globe in the early 20th century, isolated places. How did they manage to leave? How and why did they return? And I think maybe most importantly, how could he find himself in this situation? Having naturalized as an American citizen in good faith, having served in the U.S. Army, admirably receiving an honorable discharge, and yet, when he returns to the Ottoman Empire, being denied recognition as a U.S. citizen. How could that happen? And what explains the process that leads to that point in 1906 and 1907? Those are the kinds of questions that my book seeks to answer. And so to give, oh, there we go. Is it going to stay? No. All right. To begin answering some of these questions, between 1885 and 1915, somewhere between 75,000, 80,000 Armenians migrate to the United States. For much of that time, the epicenter is a region surrounding the dual cities of Harput, Harpert, Mezre here in central eastern Anatolia. So we're talking about the vast majority, or the majority of these migrants are coming from the Harput region, places like Palu, Harpert, Huseinik, Keri. And I know this is somewhat ironic that I open with the Gurinci and then say that this is primarily a Harpertsi development. But the majority, especially in the period before 1908, are coming from this region here. And there are several reasons for this. Why does this large-scale migration emerge in the late 1880s? And I argue that it's a convergence of factors in this period that help to describe why so many Armenians depart this region in this period and why they go to North America. Of course, the presence of Protestant missionaries and the famous Euphrates College is part of this story. Also, the arrival of European steamships to secondary ports along the Black Sea and Mediterranean coasts is part of that story also, significantly bringing down the cost of passage and the time it took to sail from the Ottoman Empire to North America. But it's also related to the fact that migration, especially temporary migration, is a long-standing practice among Armenians in these regions. Of course, the concept of the pandukht, the person who goes to Istanbul or to Aleppo or to Adana for 5, 6, 7 years, working as porters, working in cotton factories along the Mediterranean, sending money back home and then eventually returning. Migration to North America is, in a sense, an evolution from regional migration to international migration. But this, of course, raises an important point, that migration to North America is far more perilous, it's far more expensive, it's a lot further away than a place like Istanbul, Adana. And so another important factor that drives migration to North America from especially this region here, and why they're coming from places like Harpert or Huseinik or Keri and not as much from Mush or Bitlis, is because, relatively speaking, here I'm talking in comparative terms and not absolute terms, the Harpert region is a degree more politically and economically stable for Armenians in places like Sassoon or Mush further east. especially if we're thinking about the massacres of the mid-1890s, which are particularly devastating for places like Sassoon and Mush. Generally speaking, it is more manageable to take what is a massive risk because again, we're talking here mostly young, single or recently married men who are engaging in this migration, not exclusively, of course, but the majority of them, to take that risk to leave your family, your parents, your bride, to go abroad for an indeterminate amount of time, unsure when you're going to return or if you're going to be able to return. To do that is a major risk, is a massive risk, and in part because generally speaking, comparatively speaking, Armenian life in places like Harper is a little bit more economically and politically stable than especially those communities further east. This risk is somewhat more manageable. Nonetheless, migration for Armenians to North America is particularly and especially difficult and even dangerous. Why? Because when Armenian migration, large-scale Armenian migration to North America begins wrapping up in the mid and late 1880s, the Ottoman state, this is of course the period of the rule of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who is known for his particular distrust and violent attitude toward Ottoman Armenians, views this migration, the emergence of this migration in the late 1880s, as inextricably linked to the simultaneous emergence of Armenian political organizations like the Hunchakian Revolutionary Party in 1888 or the ARF in the early 1890s, sees the emergence of these political networks and this migration as being two sides of the same coin. And so in 1888, the Ottoman state under Sultan Abdul Hamid II officially forbids Armenians from migrating to North America. And it's specifically directed this ban at Armenian migrants. At the same time, you have Lebanese, Syrians who are leaving and going to North America. You have Assyrians and Muslims who are leaving and going to North America. And while there are some restrictions on their ability to migrate, none of these groups face the same degree of mistrust, and they are not subject to the same degree of restrictions on their ability to migrate as Armenians are. And the concern is on the part of the Ottoman state, concern, I would argue, bordering on paranoia, is that Armenians are going to go to the United States. They are going to join these political networks, and they are going to return to the Ottoman Empire, and they are going to sow discord, they are going to sow sedition. And so then from the perspective of the Ottoman state, Armenian migration poses a particular and very specific threat, one that needs to be prevented at all costs. And again, the assumption here is, the Ottoman state, of course, is not the only government in this period that seeks to restrict people from migrating. Often we think of restrictions on migration in this period from places like Italy or Austria-Hungary or Russia as an effort to try to keep people from leaving, a good tax base, a good labor base from leaving and going abroad and essentially giving economic benefit to a rival state. That's not what the Ottomans are doing here. The Ottoman state is not afraid of Armenians leaving and staying abroad. They're afraid of Armenians leaving and then coming back. And so the assumption here that underlines this migration is the idea that this is a temporary move, that people are going abroad with the assumption and intention of coming back. And as a result of this ban, as a result of this migration ban, Armenian migrants do what migrants today in the 21st century do when states try to impede their mobility. They find clandestine ways to leave. They leave through smuggling networks. And so my book traces the emergence of these complex smuggling networks that emerge in the Harpert region that begin leading people to the Black Sea ports of Samsun and Trabzon, later down to places like Mersin and Iskenderun on the Mediterranean Sea. And by the beginning of the 20th century, here this gives, oh, is it going to turn? perfect. Right, as far south as places like Beirut and Latakia along the eastern Mediterranean. Some, especially Armenians from Keri, are smuggled through Batumi across the Russian border and then sail across the Black Sea and Mediterranean to various European port cities. These smuggling networks are very, very highly coordinated, linking migration agents in places like Harpert or Keri to hoteliers and boatmen in places like Mersin and Beirut, who are then themselves connected to a wide range of intermediaries in European port cities and also in the United States that help these very sophisticated networks function over vast stretches of space. And so these networks become absolutely key to allowing Armenians to continue migrating to North America in the face of this increasingly tightening migration ban as the Ottoman state works harder and harder to try to prevent them from leaving. And this works. But at the same time, as clandestine migration, as is the case in the 21st century, clandestine migration is expensive, it's risky, it can be dangerous. And so again, that links to this issue that those who are migrating, those who are going to North America in this period, they are not coming from the most impoverished socioeconomic classes. They are people with relative degrees of means who can either pay off immediately the costs that it takes to migrate through these clandestine smuggling channels, or at least assume that they'll be able to pay off the debts that they often incur by migrating through these smuggling channels. And so this continues, this clandestine movement, until 1908, when the Young Turk Revolution, in the aftermath of the Young Turk Revolution, this migration ban is lifted, and Armenians and other Ottomans are allowed to freely move both in and outside of the Ottoman Empire. But what is especially striking and surprising about Ohannes' story, Ohannes Topalian's story, is the issue of return migration, is the fact that in this period, even in the aftermath of the Hamidian massacres, that Armenian migrants continue to return to the Ottoman Empire in relatively large numbers, and in the face of Ottoman state efforts to keep them out. And so, in the 1890s and in the first decade of the 20th century, I estimate something like, and this is probably a pretty conservative estimate, 15 to 20% of those who migrate to North America eventually return to their home communities in the Ottoman Empire. Now, when I'm saying return here, this isn't necessarily a permanent move. So people come back to visit aging parents. People come back to get married and start families. People return to recover from illnesses. People return because they're feeling homesick and they want to visit their families. So oftentimes return itself is not a permanent move, and people will go back through these smuggling networks and return back to the United States. But by the beginning of the 20th century, you have large, in places like Harput, Keri, Palu, large populations of people who have migrated to North America and have returned either permanently or on a temporary basis. Many of these people who return come back as, like Ohannes Topalian, after having naturalized as American citizens. American citizenship law is, certainly compared to citizenship law throughout much of Europe and Asia in this time, relatively lax. After a 5-year residency period, one is allowed to apply for naturalization, and many Armenians do, in this period, after spending 5 years in the United States, naturalize as American citizens. Those who return, however, as they're returning to the Ottoman Empire, return migration, especially if you have naturalized as an American citizen. Under Ottoman law, all Ottoman subjects are required to gain permission of the Ottoman state before they can adopt the citizenship of a foreign state. Part of this links to concerns that those who change citizenship, those who become, for example, British nationals or French nationals, or American nationals can benefit from the capitulations. These are extraterritorial privileges that are given to nationals, subjects of foreign states in the Ottoman Empire that gives them a good deal of immunity from Ottoman law. The Ottoman state, part of their concern about Armenian return migration is that Armenians will return claiming American citizenship and therefore be able to benefit from these legal immunities. And so the Ottoman state, when Armenians begin returning in relatively large numbers in the mid-1890s, is very concerned about this question of Armenians who have naturalized as American citizens. And in the context of the Hamidian massacres in the mid-1890s, reports begin filing out. These are American consular reports. These are also files in the Ottoman state archives about people who are returning, Armenians who are returning from sojourns abroad to port cities like Samsun and Mersin, bearing American passports and claiming American citizenship. And so the Ottoman state begins arresting these people, holding them in prison, often for months at a time. And the American government, in the context of the Hamidian massacres, gets word of this mistreatment of American citizens and complains to the Ottoman state. These people who are coming, bearing American passports, you, the Ottoman government, do not have the right to arrest and detain these people. You are violating our sovereign right, the United States sovereign right, to guarantee protection to its citizens. And this, in the context of the news coming out of the Ottoman East about the ravages and violence of the Hamidian massacres, which of course is a press sensation in the United States. A lot of this press is being generated by missionary reports of the nature of the violence of the Hamidian massacres. And these reports are being featured on the front pages of the New York Times, of the Washington Post. This is a national crisis in the United States as these reports of violence against Armenian Christians, against missionaries, American missionaries in the Ottoman Empire, again, are plastered on the front pages of American newspapers. And alongside these reports of the violence of the mid-1890s are also these reports of American citizens, Armenian returnees, whose passports are being violated by the Ottoman state. And this, in the minds of many Americans, fits together, right? The willingness of the Ottoman state to engage in violence against Christians is being driven by this, is the same logic that is driving the Ottoman state to arrest and detain American citizens. And so a diplomatic row breaks out between the Ottoman state and the United States government about the handling, about the treatment of these Armenian returnees who are claiming U.S. citizenship. But the Ottoman state has a particularly effective ambassador in Washington, a person by the name of Mavroyeni Bey, who is a Phaneriote Greek, so from a Greek Christian family with very close ties to the Ottoman dynasty. And Mavroyeni Bey is a very loyal Ottoman, and he is also a very savvy political wheeler-dealer. And so he sees this brewing diplomatic crisis between the Ottoman state and the American government. But he also knows in the mid-1890s is a period of burgeoning hostility against immigrant groups in the United States. This is a period where you have large numbers of Italian immigrants, Eastern European Jewish immigrants, Lebanese immigrants coming to the United States. And the influx of these different groups is creating a nativist backlash in the United States. And Mavroyeni Bey seeks to take advantage of this political climate. And so he begins crafting a counter-narrative in the mid-1890s to essentially fight against this idea that the reason why the Ottoman state is arresting and detaining American citizens is because somehow the Ottoman state is backward and savage. Instead, he argues, Mavroyeni, both to his diplomatic contacts in the State Department, but also putting out press reports in American newspapers that Armenians are a dangerous immigrant group, that they are adopting American citizenship in bad faith and going back to sow discord in the Ottoman Empire, much like Italian anarchists or German communists are doing in the United States. And that what the Ottoman government is doing by denying these returnees from coming back in is the same thing that the United States is doing when it's trying to restrict immigrants coming into the United States. And in the aftermath of the Hamidian massacres, as the kind of press reports about the violence begins to subside, and we all know that Americans tend to have short memories, that begins to fade. The news of the violence, of the massacres, begins to fade from the American popular imagination. And instead, by the late 1890s and coming into the first years of the 20th century, what's replaced in the minds of many American policymakers, as well as many members of the American public, is this idea that Armenians are a dangerous immigrant group like Italians, just like Jews, just like Lebanese. And therefore, that idea that they're misusing American citizenship, going back to sow discord in the Ottoman Empire, makes sense in the minds of many American policymakers in the context of this growing anti-immigration fervor that is taking hold in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. And so, in this context, in 1901, after several negotiations between the United States and the Ottoman government, the United States State Department guarantees the Ottoman state that it will no longer recognize the citizenship status of naturalized Armenian returnees who go back to their home communities in the Ottoman Empire and don't make the fact of their American citizenship known to Ottoman authorities. So, if you are an Armenian returnee and you go back to your home, you land at Samsun, for example, and you don't claim American citizenship. You say, I'm an Ottoman subject. I'm just returning from working in Alexandria in Egypt for a couple of years. And you're admitted back into the Ottoman Empire. Because you did not make the fact of your American citizenship known the minute you returned, you have, in the eyes of American diplomatic officials in the Ottoman state, voluntarily forfeited your citizenship. So effectively, right, this is denaturalizing these Armenian returnees by fiat. And I mean, this is to some extent hard to imagine. We think when somebody adopts, when somebody naturalizes an American citizen, that status as an American citizen is inviolable, is inalienable. But in fact, in the context of moving across borders, all of a sudden, that citizenship status becomes very fragile. And here's the rub. If an Armenian comes to Samsun, for example, and claims American citizenship, the Ottoman state has the right to immediately disbar that person, essentially send them back. So if you want to go back and visit your family, get married, settle estates, whatever the case might be, you have no choice but to hide the fact of your American citizenship. That's the only way you'll be able to get back in. That's, for example, exactly what Ohannes Topalian did in 1901. He traveled before going back to Kayseri. He goes to Egypt and he obtains Ottoman travel documents in Egypt. He leaves his American passport behind. He takes these Ottoman travel documents and uses those to re-enter the empire, so it hides the fact that he had been unlawfully in the United States. Many Armenian returnees, most Armenian returnees in this period are doing exactly that. They're having to enter through the back door, hiding the fact of their American citizenship. But now, after 1901, doing that means that they are stripped, at least in the eyes of American diplomatic officials in the Ottoman Empire, of their protections as U.S. citizens. Now, after 1908, in 1908, Sultan Abdul Hamid's despotic powers are taken away from him in a palace coup. The Ottoman constitution of the late 1870s is restored. And one of the guarantees that constitutional rule brings is the guarantee of freedom of movement. so that now all Ottoman citizens, regardless of their ethnic or religious background, can freely move both within the Ottoman Empire, but also migrate abroad and return to the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, in this period between 1908 and 1915, you see a significant surge both of Armenians leaving, going to North America, but also returning, taking advantage of the fact that it is no longer unlawful for them to do so. However, it is still, if they have not gained official Ottoman permission to change their nationality, illegal for them to claim American citizenship when they return. So they're still, even after these bans have been lifted after 1908, having to hide the fact that they've naturalized as American citizens when they return to the Ottoman Empire. And this has particular impact in 1915. Of course, the Harput region is devastated by the deportations and the genocide of 1915. And Leslie Davis, the famous U.S. consul in Harput, who a few years after witnessing the genocide writes what will become the book known as Slaughterhouse Province, in which he details the crimes that he witnessed during the early years of World War I against Armenians. He talks about people coming to the consular offices in 1915 claiming American citizenship. And he talks about how he was forced to deny them protections of American citizenship, again, under that 1901 State Department rule that strips citizenship protection from those who come back to the Ottoman Empire without making the fact of their citizenship known. And he talks about being able to protect the assets, the money that's given to him, and other movable property for his office to protect in the context of the violence and despoliation of the genocide. But he talks about how his hands are tied in being able to extend protections to those who claim American citizenship. And this continues, and I argue that this also provides the legal basis in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, as the Republic of Turkey is trying to negotiate with the United States effectively to keep Armenians out of Turkey so that they cannot make claims on lost properties that were taken from them during the genocide, that this 1901 policy also becomes critical in those negotiations, preventing Armenians who have naturalized as American citizens without first getting permission of the Ottoman and now Turkish states from returning and making claims on lost properties. So this becomes, again, this practice becomes the basis also of this post-genocide effort to keep Armenians out of the Republic of Turkey so that they cannot make legal claims to property that had been taken away from them. So this is a significant story that outlives this story of Armenians going back and forth between the Ottoman East and North America in the late 19th century and first decade of the 20th century. And so I argue that this is a significant story, of course, not only for Armenian history, the history of Armenian migration, but it also sheds light on and helps us to understand the kinds of unique difficulties that migrants today face as they cross borders, having to go through clandestine smuggling networks that have only become more dangerous, more expensive, more deadly as states throughout the world try to clamp down on the ability of people to move, that the Armenian experience in the late 19th and early 20th centuries sheds light on these dynamics that we see today in the 21st century, and that, of course, it also sheds this very important light on this, what becomes a very important set of legal foundation that prevents Armenians from seeking any kind of monetary recourse for their lost lands in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. So it's a multi-layered story that essentially sees these Armenian migrants fall in between and become victims of not only the policies of the Ottoman state, but also of those of the United States government. And that when caught between these two powerful states, right, of course it makes these people who are moving across vast stretches of space, across borders, much more vulnerable. And so I'll leave it there, and I'd like to open it up for any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. I think my dad came on a Nansen passport. Can you explain how that ties into immigration from Turkey to the United States?
All right. So the Nansen passport is of course it's a post World War I creation, and in the aftermath of the collapse of the Ottoman state, we're seeing. So this is an important component of the story that up until the aftermath of World War I, passports were not required for international travel. Right? The vast majority of people did not travel across borders with passports before the 1920s. But in the context of the aftermath of World War I, the Ottoman state has collapsed. There's no definable state authority in large swaths of the Middle East. There's this question of these refugees who are survivors of genocide, who have been displaced as a result of the violence. The nascent Republic of Turkey does not see them anymore as nationals, so effectively they're stateless. And the Nansen passport becomes a way to begin, this kind of international document, to begin to provide some sort of protection outside of the umbrella of state authority to these refugees who have been rendered stateless by genocide and by the collapse of the Ottoman state. And so the Nansen passport is a perfect reflection of the emergence of the international migration control regime that we see today that makes especially those who are stateless. We can think of, for example, Palestinians in Lebanon, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon today who are effectively stateless and have to travel with laissez-passer documents. The Nansen passport is a reflection that that is going to become a major component of the 20th century world as passports and citizenship become central to being able to move across borders. There's a couple of questions back there.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk.
Sorry, I just like to turn my ear toward.
Yes, thank you so much for this amazing talk, and it's so timely with the immigration problems right now. I don't understand exactly that first person, Topalian. Why U.S. didn't accept him back to U.S.? Was it because he was hiding his U.S. citizenship when he first went back?
So this is a good question, and I forgot to, of course, sort of to complete the circle with Ohannes' story. So he eventually does return with his wife and daughter to the United States without an American passport. And again, this reflects the fact that we're talking about a period, again, this is 1907, 1908, before passports are required for international travel. So he is eventually able to make it back to the United States. He lives the rest of his life I think in Worcester or Watertown, I can't remember which, outside of Boston. He lives, I think, to a pretty ripe old age, in his 80s. And his daughter, in fact, is the one who's responsible for giving these images to Project SAVE, as well as, and so Project SAVE also has his naturalization papers, also has his military discharge papers. So they're all available, they all survive. So if that's the case, if he doesn't need an American passport, why is he going to the consul? Why is he seeking to get these documents to begin with? And my best guess, because I can't interview him and it's not reflected in the documentary evidence, is that he's hoping that a passport is going to ease his way out of the Ottoman Empire, that he's not going to have to go through these smuggling networks, that he's going to be able to get some degree of protection as he's seeking to leave the Ottoman Empire. And so he's hoping to be able to secure the U.S. passport as evidence of the fact that he's an American citizen. But because he returned to the Ottoman Empire in 1901 without making the fact of his naturalization known, right? He went to Egypt, he got Ottoman travel papers, he came in essentially masquerading as an Ottoman subject. The consul says, under this 1901 diktat, essentially, we can't recognize your citizenship status. We can't offer you any assistance. And so effectively in the Ottoman Empire, he's been denaturalized. He has lost the privileges of American citizenship. Now, once he goes back to the United States, of course, there's no record of this fact that he's been denaturalized, and he can resume his status as an American citizen. It's just when he's in the Ottoman Empire, he has, in the eyes of these diplomatic authorities, been voluntarily denaturalized himself, voluntarily forfeited his citizenship protections.
Thank you, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. There are a lot of Armenians now in this country who have papers of ownership of land right now in the homeland that we lost. Is any of this going to be any impediment when they come to actually claim back what they owned in those years?
Yeah, I mean, I think what happens is, again, after World War I, these questions, and for example, Taner Aksham talks about this when he's talking about the discarded properties, or I can't remember exactly how it's translated, that the Republic of Turkey is very adamant about essentially looking back to Ottoman citizenship law to find any way to effectively render these Armenian migrants stateless so that they cannot return to Turkey and lay claim to these lost properties. And I think that this 1901 decision by the State Department becomes an incredibly effective trump card in the pocket of the Republic of Turkey to basically argue that these people left without permission, they naturalized as American citizens without permission, so therefore we don't have to view them as nationals of the Ottoman Empire or nationals of Turkey. And that becomes the basis for preventing them from returning. So again, these laws that don't allow Armenians to return in the Ottoman period are carried over into the Turkish Republican period and become critical in keeping people out so they can't lay legal claims to lost properties.
But then consequently, this will raise a question in the courts when the lawsuits come up and lawyers get involved and the rest of the battle.
Right, yeah. I mean, the fact that people couldn't return immediately in the 1920s and 1930s, now with the distance of time, it becomes much harder, 100 years after the fact, to be able to legally pursue these cases.
I have a question. What was the cost to come from, let's say, from Harper to the United States?
Right, so the documentation talks about this, and there are widely varying costs. And I think a lot of this has to do with what port cities people are leaving from. But a common fee that I see quoted is something like 15 lira, which is tied to the pound, the British pound at the time. And so we're talking about, if we're to adjust to 21st century inflation, in the order of $10,000 to $15,000 in 21st century money. This would be the equivalent of $10,000 to $15,000 in 21st century money, a significant sum. And again, this is often what it costs now migrants to travel through these clandestine channels, 15, 20, 25,000. That's very common for people, leaving from Syria, leaving from sub-Saharan Africa. And again, that gets to this question that the people who are leaving through these channels aren't the poorest of the poor. They're people who have at least some degree of means, who can either pay up front or will eventually be able to pay off these debts that they incur traveling through these networks. But it's a very, very expensive proposition.
What's the punishment by the Ottoman government if you're caught?
If you're caught leaving, you're just going to be returned home. So you might be detained, jailed for a while, but you'll be sent back under armed guard. What I didn't mention is that, of course, a lot of Armenians come back, are living in their home communities in the first decade of the 20th century. And especially in 1904 and 1905. In 1905, there's an assassination attempt on Sultan Abdulhamid II that's carried out by the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. This, of course, amps up the Hamidian government's paranoia, and the Ottoman state begins vigorously cracking down on return migration, but also on people who have already returned, who are living back in their home communities. When it's uncovered that they have returned from unlawful sojourns in North America, they're often deported. So they're arrested, they are taken under armed guard to Samsun or to Trabzon, they're forced onto ships and they're sent out. And so return migration is actually a much more can be a much more dangerous proposition, especially in the first decade of the 20th century, because those who are caught face deportation from the empire. And so it becomes, in fact, there are petitions sent from the Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul seeking stays of deportation, protections from deportation. It becomes actually a very traumatic experience in 1905, 1906, 1907, as people are being sort of searched out, discovered to have returned from unlawful sojourns in North America, and arrested and deported from the empire. So can be a dangerous proposition. And this raises another very important question. So in the context of these deportations, and of course I'm being careful here, right, because this is different than the deportations of the genocide. These are individuals who are being arrested by Ottoman authorities in their home communities, and they're being sent by force to port cities and essentially sent out of the empire. This raises a really important question on the part of the Ottoman state. All of this does. Who is an Armenian? What does it mean to be an Armenian? In Ottoman law, in Ottoman practice, Ermeni, the term Ermeni, Armenian, is not an ethnic term. It's a religious term. It's a sectarian term. Ermeni is a member of the Apostolic Church. So an Armenian Catholic or an Armenian Protestant is not an Ermeni. They are a Catholic or they are a Protestant. But in the context of these migration laws and the migration ban, the Ottoman state is not worried specifically about members of the Apostolic Church. They are worried about Armenians as the ARF would define it, or as the Hunchakian Revolutionary Party would define it, not on sectarian terms, but on ethnic terms. And so the Ottoman state, in the context especially of these deportations, has to say, when we talk about Armenians need to be deported, here we are talking about this in terms of an ethnic term. It doesn't matter if they're Protestant. It doesn't matter if they're Catholic. It doesn't matter if they're apostolic. All of them would face deportation. All of them are subject to this migration ban. And for example, if you are an Armenian and you convert to Assyrian Orthodoxy, and now you are a member of the Assyrian religious community, the Ottoman state says you can't do that. You can't convert your religion to avoid deportation. Once, under this law at least, once you're an Armenian, you're always an Armenian. And so that even if you convert to Assyrian Orthodoxy, even if you convert to Islam, that's not enough. You're still a suspect person. And of course, this logic would then also frame the logic of the genocide itself in 1915, where who is an Armeni is not something that's defined along sectarian lines, but it's something that's defined along ethnic lines.
So I'm continuing. The passports that you saw in the museum, one of them said Latin, one said Protestant,
Right.
one said Armenian.
Right.
So why do they do it for themselves so that they can differentiate?
So the Ottoman state defines people, and this is a long-standing Ottoman practice, not along ethnic lines, but along sectarian lines. So this is the idea of the millet system. So a member of the Ermeni millet is not any Armenian. Rather, it's a member of the Apostolic Church. So if you are an Armenian Catholic, you're not a member of the Armenian millet, you're part of the Catholic millet. And so sectarian definition in this traditional practice, right, it's sectarian, not ethnic, but in the context of this migration, all of a sudden we see essentially the Ottoman state disposing with this older practice of defining people along sectarian lines, and instead, it doesn't matter if you're Protestant, Catholic, Apostolic, it doesn't matter if you convert, the religion aspect is not important, it's your ethnic identity that's important, that's significant. That's what they're worried about. Language, right. Although of course, you have Turcophone Armenians also who would be classified as Armenian. So, but yeah, I mean, in the sense that the Ottoman state, is adopting the same definition of Armenianness that organizations like the ARF are, who don't distinguish between these sectarian differences, but rather see Armenians as an ethnic community rather than a sectarian community. Well, mixed marriages in this context, I mean, of course, it would depend on which religious sect the father belongs to in Ottoman law. So if a Muslim man married an Armenian woman, then the state would view the offspring of that marriage as a Muslim. The reverse situation would be very hard. The Ottoman state, as well as these religious communities, would especially frown on the idea, for example, of an Armenian man marrying a Muslim woman.
Remember some years ago, a secret came out that Armenians had a special mark in their passport, Armenian, Jews, and Turkish. Number 1 was for Armenian, number 2 was for the Jewish, and the third was the Turkish message.
Mm-hmm.
So how much is this playing into the politics now?
So it would be very explicit. So on travel documents issued by the Ottoman state, they always made very explicit which sectarian community that person belonged to. But the problem there is it would not mention what ethnic group that person belonged to. So for example, these documents that the museum has in its possession, these are Ottoman internal passports. They are the people that were granted these passports were clearly Armenians. They have very Armenian names. But nowhere on the passport does it say they are Armeni. Instead, it says their religious, their sectarian identity, Catholic, Protestant. So if one was Jewish, it would say Jewish. If one was Assyrian, it would say Assyrian. If one was Greek Orthodox, it would say Rum. So it all depended, again, on one's sectarian background. As you get now, even today, Turkish passports, Turkish identity documents list the religion of the bearer, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Armenian, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Rum or Greek. So that practice still continues into the 21st century. As far as secret markings, I'm not sure about the story there. But again, these issues, these identities are extremely important to the state, both the Ottoman state and now the Republic of Turkey. And so they're made explicit on people's travel documents and identity documents.
We had a neighbor when we first moved to the U.S. In Laguna Beach. He was an 80-year-old proctologist from South Dakota, Armenian. His name was Gulderia. His father had left the area near Sivas in the late 80s, early 1900s. He became a physician, and he lived in Boston. So in 1912, his father calls him to go back to visit him. As he goes all the way to the port, he doesn't dare leave the port to enter the Turkey because maybe of the fear of putting his citizenship. He goes back. You only see his father waving from the ship to the harbor. He couldn't go back to see his family. That's the real one.
Right, and even then, in something like 1912, of course, by then a lot of these bans had been lifted. But if you had naturalized as an American citizen and you were returning claiming American citizenship, if you hadn't gotten permission from the Ottoman state to do that, the Ottoman state wouldn't let you in. So it's possible that's the situation he's talking about. Like you said, that he was afraid to go in as masquerading as an Ottoman subject because he worried about losing his American citizenship, but that means then he couldn't re-enter. Yeah. Well, there's a. Oh, you're going to take that. Okay.
I'm not sure how to phrase this exactly, but for those, let's say, children who were born in the U.S., but to parents who have been naturalized, when the families return with these children now who were born in the U.S. with U.S. citizenship, would then those children have protection?
So this is a great question. I'm glad you asked this because of Columbia. So the question is, what about children who are native born in the United States? So their parents come over. The parents may have naturalized as American citizens, but their children were born in this country, and so therefore they are natural-born American citizens. Would they, if they return, be afforded protection by the U.S. consul, or would they be stripped of their nationality, these native-born citizens? And the reason I'm really glad you asked this question, 2 weeks ago I wouldn't have been sure, but now I can give you a firm answer to this question. Columbia University has just released a whole, and made freely available, a whole set of oral interviews of Armenian genocide survivors, and those also who came before the genocide. These recordings were mainly made in the 1960s and 1970s. And so now they're all freely available. And I listened to one, just randomly listened to one, and his whole story was exactly this. His parents came over, lived, I think, in Providence. He was born in the United States, I think, in 1907, and then he and his family went back. So he was a native-born American citizen. And they were there in 1915 in Harpers. And his mother was able to take him to the American consulate, and the American consul did provide him and his mother and his brother protection. And I think the advantage he had is she had a birth certificate that showed that he was born in the United States. And so therefore his citizenship was not alienable. And they recognized him as an American citizen and afforded him protection. And in his interview, he talks about other children, essentially in the same circumstance, that the American consul, Leslie Davis, did afford these protections to native-born citizens that were not given to naturalized citizens. So that's a really important distinction between who was able to claim protection and who could not claim protection. There's a question in the back of him.
The laws are still the same when you're naturalized and you go back to your native country and you have a problem, the American government will not protect you.
Yeah, I mean, if you, for example, return, it depends on what passport you show at the border of the country you're traveling to. But there were agreements. So this was a problem that the United States government had not only with the Ottoman state, but with Germany, with France, with Britain. So in the late 19th century, the American government signed a raft of treaties with Germany, with France, with the United Kingdom, with Austria-Hungary, governing how long a naturalized citizen could reside in their home country before they were seen to have forfeited their citizenship. And often that period was set at 2 years. If you go back to your home country and you live there for 2 years, after that 2-year period is over, you are considered to have voluntarily forfeited your citizenship. The big difference, of course, with this story is that Armenians were deemed to have lost their citizenship immediately upon returning. So that's a big distinction. There was no set treaty between the Ottoman state and the United States government. So it became that by the first years of the 20th century that simply by returning you forfeited citizenship.
How long was the Turkish ambassador, the Greek Turkish ambassador in the United States?
He was in the United States beginning in the early 1890s, and I think he left 1897, and he made it his mission. He was, very, very good at public relations. So, again, trying to put the best light on the Ottoman government as possible. But he also was very keen, and there's a whole set of documents on in the Ottoman archives about his efforts to spy on suspected Armenian revolutionaries in the United States in the mid-1890s, including hiring the Pinkerton Detective Agency to try to spy on these organizations. So he was very interested in trying to gather intelligence and find out how these organizations functioned. So it's fascinating insight into how states work and how they try to keep tabs on their subjects and citizens when they're abroad. But he's there for about 5 years, and then he is moved, I think, to Austria-Hungary in the late 1890s.
Anti-Armenian sentiment will come in. Is it homegrown idea, or there's a group of advisors behind
Yeah, so the question is this, is this Abdul Hamid himself? Is this sort of anti-Armenian sentiment, these anti-Armenian laws, are they sprouting primarily from the person of Abdul Hamid himself, or are there a set of advisors that are helping to give shape to it? And so it's not just Abdul Hamid II, it's suffused throughout the entire Ottoman bureaucracy. The logic is, and what's amazing is how fast this happens. I mean, again, I think that the Hunchakian Revolutionary Party is founded in 1897. The ARF isn't even founded yet in 1888 when this policy is made banning Armenians from going to North America. And yet it is the logic, the overriding logic, the explicit logic is that we can't allow Armenians to go abroad because they're going to be corrupted by these political organizations, which suggests that already by the 1880s there is this deep-seated fear not only of non-Muslim nationalist movements, but particularly of the emergence of Armenian political networks. That Armenians aren't just one of many different non-Muslim communities in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman state, by the 1880s and 1890s, views Armenians as a very particular kind of threat. And it's clearly by the 1880s, again, it's not just Abdul Hamid, it's suffused throughout the entire bureaucracy. And in fact, Ron Sunni talks about this in his book, his recent book, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else. This idea of, he calls it an affective disposition in the Ottoman bureaucracy. There's just this assumption, this deep-seated assumption that Armenians pose a very specific threat. And Sunni talks about this as being a key driver of the genocide. This assumption that Armenians are marked as a specific and special threat. And I argue in the book that the evidence seems like it's there for that argument. Right.
Any other question? Yeah, my question is the fact of Protestant missionary work in Anatolia. Did that facilitate the interests on the part of the Armenians to migrate to North?
So yes, I think that the missionaries are a central part of the story in, as you say, kind of seeding the idea that North America, and especially the American Northeast, places like Worcester, Fitchburg, Watertown, Boston, New York, that these are places where people can go find jobs, send money back, that the missionaries play an important role in creating that information. But I also think it's important not to overstress the importance of the missionaries. That the missionaries are part of the story, but I would argue they're not even the main part of the story. That migration to North America rather grows out of this long-standing practice of temporary migration within the Ottoman Empire, going to places like Adana, Aleppo, Istanbul, Baku, and that it really grows out of that practice. It's a longer distance version of these more regional temporary migrations that long precede the presence of missionaries in places like Harpert. No, go ahead.
I'm sure there was a reason for these migrations. Probably it was mostly economic reasons or...
Yeah, so a mix. So economic reasons, of course, but in the aftermath of the Hamidian massacres, of course, the increasing difficulty of Armenian life in the Ottoman East becomes a major driver of migration also. And it also creates a split stream in migration, because the Ottomans, after the Hamidian massacres, open up a legal route for Armenian migration. And so the Ottoman state, allows Armenians to migrate as long as they promise to give up all connections to their home communities, forfeit their Ottoman nationality, and agree never to return. And again, the logic here is clear. As long as Armenians are gone, it's fine. What we're worried about is if they come back. And so that legal route which was again created after the Hamidian massacres, is we'll let you go. We'll let you go to the United States, but again, you have to forfeit everything. You can't come back. You can't maintain connections with your home communities. You can't claim Ottoman subjecthood anymore. And I think Zeynep Gürsel will be...
That may not
Yeah, Zeynep Gürsel, who is a scholar who's working on exactly this aspect of the migration story, will be coming here and talking about how that process worked, how the Ottoman state took images, took photographs of people who were given this legal channel to migrate, but these photographs were to be used at ports to basically try to identify people who might try to return after they've agreed not to. And again, the logic, again, is clear, right? People are fine if they leave and never come back.
And I think it was much easier for Protestants to leave because the missionaries were helping the Protestants.
Yeah, so it was generally, and she'll be able to shed more light on this, easier for example, the spouses and children of naturalized American citizens who are living in the United States. It was easier for them to go through this channel because American consular authorities would provide assistance, and also missionaries would provide assistance to kind of navigate the bureaucracy of gaining these legal permissions.
Okay, this concludes our event. I'm sorry I lost my voice and my microphone too. We don't know what's going to happen with the future lectures. I put the flyers out. I don't know if my guest is coming from Oxford March 28th. I have to find out. Ara told me the moratorium because of the residents as of yesterday. And even families cannot come to see their loved ones because of the fear of what's going on. So I think things will be better eventually. Please stay tuned. Check our website. If we don't have the event in here and the speaker said he will come on March 28th, we will be having a new organization of Istanbul Armenians. They're opening their doors for us to do our lecture over there. So we're not sure March 28th and April 16th event what's going to happen.
What's the reason?
Because of the coronavirus. Because of the residents that we have, the elderly, and they're worried about it. Yes, we will. If anything changes, I'll update the website, I'll update the email list, and the Armenian calendar of events, even the newspaper will be. And I'm very grateful to the organization of Istanbul Armenians. They allowed us to use their facility. It'll be the same date, maybe we'll change it to Sunday, I don't know. I hate to do it, but I'm sorry, my hands are tied up. And that's why we're expecting no reception, nothing today, and I have a close my voice. But let's give a big hand for it.
Thank you.
Other materials, and I'm sure that he's going to come over again and lecture us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Maybe need to charge him. No. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, it was the original presentation was a little bit shorter than I imagined, but I think the question and answer was
Yeah, the
better.
question
That's
and
always
answer.
so much better.
Speaker.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he is.
Oh, okay, I'm glad you enjoyed. Thank you for. Oh, the microphone, of course. Yeah. Sorry, everybody. Our secret conversations. There we go.